He returned home early, but found a silence that shouldn't exist, a heavy emptiness as if something had been erased even before his arrival. In the middle of the darkness, a simple cleaning lady did the impossible. She told a powerful man to be silent, and he obeyed. Upstairs, laughter, glasses, and familiar voices hid a secret capable of destroying everything he built. And on that night, while everyone believed he was dead, someone decided he needed to survive, whatever the cost. Before discovering the reason that froze even the most feared of men, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more intense stories full of twists. The private flight landed at the farm at 22 hours, without warning, without protocol, without any of the rituals that normally accompanied the arrival of Renato Drummond Lacerda anywhere in the world. No employee waited on the illuminated dirt runway. No black jeep with tinted windows approached to pick him up. Only the sound of the engine slowly dying and the fine rain that fell over the South Mato Grossense Pantanal, as if the sky had also decided to maintain secrecy that night. Renato descended the plane stairs, carrying only a leather backpack, the same one he had used for 12 years to keep the essentials, documents, a spare cell phone, and the pearl-handled revolver he had inherited from his father. He was a man of 52 years, with the posture of someone who never asked permission to enter any environment. Broad shoulders, grey hair combed to the side, a firm jaw that life had sculpted with years of hard decisions, the type of man others studied before speaking. The Drummond farm occupied 46,000 hectares between the municipality of Corumbá and the Bolivian border. It was more than a property. It was a symbol. Cattle, soy, leases, political agreements signed at dinners with governors and senators who came there to the middle of nowhere because that was where the real decisions were made. Renato had inherited the land at 24 and tripled the assets in 3 decades, diversifying into meatpacking plants, warehouses, and a small mining company that operated within the rules exactly because he never let it operate any other way. He was respected where respect meant something concrete: contracts, votes, silence. But on that night, as he stepped onto the damp mud of the private runway, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Discomfort. A kind of pressure in his chest that was neither tiredness nor hunger, but rather that silent warning that men of instinct learn to recognize before the rational mind can name it. It was the same warning that had made him refuse a meeting in Cuiabá years ago, and which he later learned had spared him from a well-set financial trap. Renato didn't believe in superstition, but he believed in his own body when it insisted on saying that something was wrong. He shouldn't have been there. Officially, Renato Drummond was in Campo Grande, in meetings with federal government representatives about renegotiating rural debts. There were records of his presence at the National Hotel, security cameras that captured his face at the entrance, even a call made from the room confirming his location that night. The alibi was solid because it had been built with care, like everything in Renato Drummond's life. But the deal had collapsed. 3 hours earlier, in a climate-controlled meeting room, the ministry representative had placed a document on the table different from what had been agreed upon: altered clauses, percentages that didn't add up, and worse, a smile. Small, discreet, of the kind that the powerful display when they know the other party has no choice. Renato read the room in seconds, folded the document, put it in his pocket, and left without giving explanations. In the hallway, he was already calling the pilot. He hadn't warned anyone he would return. Not Silvana, his wife, who had stayed at the farm with the justification of a migraine that prevented her from traveling. Not Gustavo, his right-hand man, administrator of the entire operation, a trusted man for 15 years. Renato simply returned because something inside him told him to return. Now, walking through the corridor of eucalyptus trees that led to the main house, he noticed the first sign that something was wrong. The garden light posts were off. It wasn't a blackout. The garage light was on in the background. It was a choice. Someone had turned off the external lights. The dogs weren't barking. 3 Rottweilers that never let a leaf pass without reacting. Complete silence. Renato stopped in the middle of the wet path and listened to the farm as if he were listening to an animal breathing. There was movement on the second floor. Low music, almost imperceptible, and the kind of calculated silence people create when they are trying to be discreet. He didn't enter through the main door. He went around the side garden, past the vegetable patch, and reached the service entrance at the back, which was always left unlocked because it was used by the employees in the early morning to get firewood. The door gave way without a sound. The kitchen was clean and dark. It smelled of disinfectant and of something cooked that had cooled hours ago. Renato stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, a habit learned not in any course, but in years of negotiations in environments where information arrived before words. It was then that he saw the figure in the hallway. A woman of approximately 40 years, navy blue uniform, hair tied back, holding a floor cloth with both hands, as if it were the only solid object available that night. She saw him at the same time he saw her. And for a second that seemed longer than it should have. Neither of them moved. Renato knew her face, but didn't know her name. She was the cleaning lady who had worked at the main house for at least 2 years, a woman who appeared, cleaned, disappeared, and whom he had never noticed enough to fix even her name in his memory. She was exactly the type of person that the world, as he organized it, made invisible. He opened his mouth to demand an explanation, and she did something that none of his subordinates had ever done. She took a quick step in front of him, placed her fingers in front of her lips, and with eyes wide with an urgency that didn't fit into words, tilted her head upwards. To the second floor. Renato stood still, not out of fear but because her gesture contained information that his rational parallel was still processing. She knew something, and she knew that he didn't know. And for some reason he didn't yet understand, she had decided to warn him instead of simply pretending she hadn't seen anything. From the floor above, the music got a bit louder, laughter, glasses, the unmistakable sound of an intimate and careless celebration, the kind that only happens when people believe they are completely alone. Renato recognized the laugh, even before consciously processing that he was recognizing it. It was Gustavo, and the voice that responded to it, slightly hoarse, slightly louder than usual, was Silvana's. The cleaning lady was still looking at him, not with pity, not with curiosity, with something more solid than both, a kind of practical urgency, like someone who knows that the available time is decreasing and that the decision to act or not act needed to be made now in that dark kitchen, before anything else happened. Renato Drummond, owner of 46,000 hectares, had returned home without warning anyone. And the only person on the farm who knew it was a woman whose name he didn't know. He kept looking at her for a few more seconds, trying to read what was behind those dark eyes. There was no betrayal. There was no fear of being discovered doing something forbidden. There was, on the contrary, a kind of calm determination, almost surgical, as if she had decided before his arrival what she would do in case he appeared. As if somehow she already knew what was about to happen long before Renato had even landed on that dirt runway. And then she made the simplest and most impossible gesture of the night. She extended her hand, brought it to her chest, and whispered so low he could barely hear, but her lips formed the words with absolute clarity. "My name is Cida, and from here on, you are going to need to trust me." Renato kept looking at her for 3 full seconds. It was the time it took to evaluate a man in a negotiation, and he was using that same time to evaluate that woman in a dark hallway, with the rain hitting the kitchen windows and familiar voices resonating from the floor above, like a weight that hadn't yet completely landed. Cida didn't look away. She didn't retreat. She kept her hand flat on her own chest, and her lips closed with a firmness that Renato, in all his experience with people, recognized immediately as the firmness of someone who has already made a decision and is waiting for the other side to accept the terms. He nodded once. She led him into the pantry, a small room without a window between the kitchen and the service hallway, where the week's supplies were organized on wooden shelves. She closed the door carefully and, in almost total darkness, spoke in a volume that was less than a whisper. It was the voice of someone who had learned to communicate in environments where silence had owners. She said she had arrived at 5 in the afternoon to do the weekly cleaning of the second floor, as she did every Thursday. She said that when she went up the back stairs, she heard voices in the master's office. The door was ajar, and she had stopped because she recognized Renato's name in the conversation, and when one recognizes the boss's name in a paragraph that no one should be hearing, instinct commands one to stop. What she heard, Sida said, was not a conversation. It was a plan. Renato waited. He had learned not to rush people when they were delivering important information. Haste at the wrong time produced fragments. He wanted the whole. Sida told him that Gustavo was talking to someone on the phone, someone whose voice she couldn't hear through the device, but whose answers were reflected in what Gustavo said back. He spoke about dates, about transfers of power of attorney, about how Renato's absence in Campo Grande gave the necessary time to finalize the documents at the notary's office in Corumbá, which would open at 8 in the morning the next day. He spoke about Silvana with a familiarity that was not from an administrator to the boss's wife, but of two accomplices aligning the final details of something that had already been underway for much longer than that night. And there was a phrase that Sida repeated with precision because she had repeated it mentally from the moment she heard it until that moment. If he shows up before the deadline, it will be a problem we will have to solve in a way that none of us will like. Renato heard this phrase and felt his stomach harden. Not from fear, from cold anger, the kind that doesn't ignite like fire, but settles like iron, heavy and silent, and which produces clarity instead of panic. There was an old part of him, built in the toughest negotiations of the South Matogrossense agribusiness, that knew exactly what to do when someone tried to take what was his. But there was something else, Sida said, and this was different. Before leaving the office, careful not to be seen, she had noticed Renato's desk. On the IPE wood desk where he signed documents, there was a large envelope, already open, with the stamp of the Corumbá notary's office and the crest of a law firm from Campo Grande, that she knew because the name was printed on the badge of a man who had been at the farm 3 weeks earlier, introduced by Gustavo as a logistics consultant. She wasn't a lawyer, she didn't understand powers of attorney, but she knew how to read, and what she had read in the corner of the document that had become visible when the envelope tilted was enough. Transfer of full management of the assets of Fazenda Drummond Agropecuária Litada, with immediate effect from the date of registration. Renato remained in silence for a long moment. The rain continued outside. From the floor above came the muffled sound of music, and once in a while, Silvana's voice in a tone he recognized because it had been his during 23 years of marriage, but which now sounded from a completely different place. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Sida took a moment to answer, not because she was inventing the answer, but because she was choosing the right words for a truth that was too simple to need embellishment. She said she had worked on that farm for 2 years and 2 months, that before she had worked at 3 other properties in the region, always as a day laborer, always as someone who entered through the back door, cleaned what others dirtied and left without anyone really knowing her name. She said she had a daughter in Corumbá who was in her 3rd year of nursing, and that every cent that paid the monthly fee came from what she received for cleaning those houses. She said she wasn't naive, that she knew very well that what she was doing had a risk, but that she had heard things in that office that weren't just about the boss, they were about her too. That in the plan Gustavo had described on the phone, the only 2 people in the main house that night were Silvana and himself, and that if someone needed to ensure there were no witnesses to what happened there, the math became easier if the employees simply weren't present to tell. The other 2 employees who normally slept at the main house had been dismissed earlier with the excuse of a renovation that would begin the next morning. She had stayed only because she had agreed to finish cleaning the 2nd hallway before leaving, and because Gustavo, distracted by the phone call, hadn't noticed she was still there. That was why she was telling him. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't loyalty in the sense that Renato understood when he thought of that word. It was a woman who had calculated the risks of 2 possible choices and decided that the less dangerous one, in the long run, was the one that was also the most honest. Renato kept looking at her in the darkness of the pantry for a few more moments, and then he asked if she knew an exit from the house that he didn't know. Sida answered without hesitation. She said she knew several. There was one in particular she had discovered by accident 3 months ago, when she was looking for a water valve to close during a cleaning at the back of the basement. Behind an old cedar cabinet, full of rusty tools and file boxes that no one had opened in decades. There was a low door, almost invisible against the stone of the wall, which gave access to an underground corridor. She had entered only a few meters before retreating, but enough to see that the corridor continued, wide enough for two people to walk side by side, with the dirt floor slightly sloping downwards. Renato heard this, and something in his remote memory moved. His father had mentioned once in a late afternoon conversation on the porch that his grandfather had ordered the main house to be built over an old stone structure that came from the time of the mule troops. He had said this with the tone of someone who doesn't care much for the information, and Renato, then 20 years old and with his head in another direction, hadn't paid due attention. Now this information resurfaced from an old place in his memory with a precision that time sometimes preserves better than conscious attention. His grandfather had built exits because his grandfather had survived things for which exits were necessary. Renato took a deep breath once, adjusted the backpack on his shoulder, and looked at Cedar in the dark. He had made harder decisions than trusting a cleaning lady who owed nothing to anyone and yet was there. The hardest decisions, he had discovered throughout life, were almost always the simplest when pride was removed from the equation. "Let's go," he said. And it was she who went out in front. The basement of the Fazenda Drummond headquarters smelled of time, not the smell of mold that years usually deposit in forgotten places, but the dry and mineral smell of old stones, of compacted clay, of the oxidized copper of the pipes that dated from when Renato's grandfather had done the first renovation of the original structure. It was a smell that reminded one of permanence, and permanence, Renato had learned, was exactly the opposite of what was happening that night. Zaida had taken the small flashlight she kept in her apron pocket, the type of practical object that a woman accustomed to working in spaces others ignored always carried without making an announcement. She walked ahead between the file shelves and the retired agricultural equipment, turning left until reaching the back, where the cedar cabinet leaned against the stone wall as if it had grown there. Renato pushed the cabinet with his shoulder. It was heavy, but it moved. The concrete floor below was smooth enough that someone had moved it before with regularity. This caught his attention. There were no new scratches on the concrete. The cabinet had been moved many times. By whom and when he didn't know, but the idea that that passage had been used recently by someone he couldn't identify added another layer of unease to what was already a sufficiently complicated night. The door behind the cabinet was made of thick wood with iron hinges. It opened without creaking. The hinges were lubricated. Renato noticed this and remained in silence for a moment, and Cedar, who observed him with that calm attention he was already starting to recognize as a characteristic of hers, said only, "Someone puts oil on these hinges once in a while. It wasn't me." They entered the corridor. The flashlight illuminated only a few meters ahead, but it was enough to see that the tunnel had been built with some care. The walls were of stacked stone with mortar, the ceiling low but continuous, the floor of firm earth. There were marks on the walls at elbow height, the type of mark made when one walks in a cramped space carrying something. The tunnel descended slightly for about 30 meters and then turned left, following, Renato calculated, the alignment of the irrigation canal that ran at the back of the property. As they walked, he was processing what Cedar had said. The transfer of management of the assets, the Corumba notary's office opening at 8 in the morning. Gustavo with unrestricted access to files and passwords, because that was exactly what Renato had hired him for 15 years ago, to operate the business when he himself wasn't there. It was an architecture of trust that had become an architecture of vulnerability, and the transition between the two had happened at some point he now needed to identify. But there was something more urgent than the retrospective. He took the spare cell phone out of his backpack. No signal. The tunnel was deep enough to completely block coverage, which meant that any contact with the outside world would have to wait. He put the device away and continued walking. Zaida stopped abruptly. She had raised her right hand in an instinctive gesture of pause. The flashlight pointed at the floor. Renato stopped beside her and heard what she had heard before him, footsteps above their heads. Heavy, regular, in the rhythm of someone walking with purpose. The ceiling of the tunnel transmitted the sound with surprising clarity, like a membrane between two worlds. It wasn't Silvana. Silvana walked differently, lighter. They were two pairs of footsteps, actually, one heavier than the other. And there were voices, muffled but present with the tone of urgency he recognized. People who are checking rooms. Someone was looking for them. Renato did the quick calculation. Gustavo could have received a call. The plane's pilot, upon arriving in Campo Grande or communicating the landing on some frequency, could have generated a record. There were ways to know he had returned without him having told anyone, and Gustavo had the resources and contacts to know those ways. Cida turned off the flashlight. The darkness was total and immediate, the kind that doesn't exist anywhere where the light of the world can enter. Renato stood completely still. Cida's breathing beside him was controlled and rhythmic, and he realized she was practicing a form of calmness that was not passivity, but concentration. It was the breathing of someone who had already been in difficult situations before and had learned that panic doesn't solve things, but attention does. The footsteps above moved away. The voices diminished. After a time that was difficult to measure in the absolute darkness, Cida turned the flashlight back on, now partially covered with her palm to reduce the beam's range. "We have to get to the canal before they organize something out there," she said. Renato asked how she knew the tunnel reached the canal. She said she had returned another time after the day she had discovered the passage, that she had entered by day, with a better flashlight, and walked to the end, that the tunnel ended in a stone chamber with an iron grate overhead, and that through the grate she had been able to see the sky and beside it the banks of the drainage canal that cut across the back of the farm. Renato kept looking at her for a moment. "Why did you go back?" he asked. Cida took about 2 seconds before answering. She said she had always liked to know where the exits were, that it was the kind of thing a woman learns when she spends her whole life entering through the back. They continued walking. The tunnel turned once more and began to rise. The air became slightly more humid, with the smell of wet earth and vegetation coming from the surface. Renato felt the mud on the floor change texture, softer now, and the stone of the walls gradually gave way to earth reinforced with wood. They were arriving. The iron grate was above them, exactly as Cida had described. Renato pushed with both arms. It gave way more easily than he expected. The hinges, like those of the door, were treated. He climbed up first, then extended his hand to Cida. They came out on the bank of the canal in a stretch covered by tall grass that hid them from view of the main house. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle. In the dark, with the lights of the farm in the distance, Renato could see movements. At least 3 figures moving between the buildings with flashlights, in a pattern that was not of a casual search. It was a sweep. He and Cida stayed crouched in the grass for a few moments, and then, about 200 meters along the canal, at the point where the farm's dirt path crossed with the old road that led to the town center, there was a light. A single headlight, misaligned, blinking irregularly like that of an old vehicle whose electrical system had long been asking for retirement. Cida saw it at the same time as him, and it was the first time in that whole night that he saw something close to a smile on her face. Small, discreet, but present. She said, "That car is mine." Renato looked at the blinking headlight 200 meters away, and then looked at her. Throughout the entire night, from the dark hallway with the floor cloth to the stone tunnel, and now that soaked grass with searchlights in the background, there was a constancy in Cida's behavior that he hadn't found in any of his well-paid subordinates, any of his trained advisors, any of his political allies accustomed to positioning themselves according to the wind. She simply did what needed to be done, without announcing, without negotiating, without waiting for recognition before acting. It was a form of integrity he had read about in graduation speeches and had never found in practice with that sharpness. The white 2003 Gol had the front bumper held on with wire and the passenger seat covered by a faded beach towel. The engine roared twice before catching, and the smell of old gasoline mixed with that of the rain when Cida put it in first gear, with the familiarity of someone who had put it in that gear 10,000 times. Renato Drummond, who in recent years had traveled only by private jet or armored pickup trucks with a driver, got into the car without saying a word and closed the door carefully so as not to pull off what remained of the handle. Cida pulled out slowly, without turning on the headlights, guiding by memory for the first 200 meters until the curve of the path hid them completely from the main house. Only then did she turn on the lights and accelerate towards the state highway. Renato tried the spare cell phone, a weak, intermittent signal, enough to make a call if it didn't last long. He thought quickly about who to call. There weren't many options. The entire close circle was somehow linked to Gustavo or the farm's administration. But there was one name that stayed outside that perimeter, a name that had been outside of almost everything for years by his own choice. He dialed. The phone rang 4 times. 5. On the 6th, a hoarse and slightly irritated voice answered with the tone of someone who had been woken from their first deep sleep. "Dirceu," said Renato. "It's me." There was a pause. Dirceu Falcão was Renato's older brother, 10 years ahead of him in life and 20 years removed from the family business by mutual choice, and with the agreement that neither would need to explain the reason to the other. Dirceu lived in Bonito, 300 kilometers away, managing an eco-tourism inn that barely made a profit and which he preferred infinitely to anything involving cattle, politics, or farm money. But Dirceu was someone Gustavo didn't control, and that, at that moment, was the rarest asset Renato could imagine. The call dropped before he could explain more than the essential, that he was in transit, that he couldn't return to the hotel, that he needed a place for the next few hours, and someone trustworthy who could make a discreet inquiry at the Corumbá notary's office before 8 in the morning. Dirceu listened without interrupting and said only, "I understand. Stop in, Anastasio. There's a station at the exit of the bridge. I'll send someone." The call dropped. Renato looked at the phone for a moment and then put it away. Beside him, Cida drove with her eyes on the road, but there was a new tension in her shoulders that wasn't there when they left the canal. He noticed and asked what it was. She said there was someone following them. Renato turned to the rearview mirror. About 300 meters behind, 2 high beams advanced at the same rhythm as them, maintaining the distance like someone who doesn't want to be noticed, but also doesn't want to lose sight. The secondary road they were using was not a transit route. There was no reason for another vehicle to be there at that hour, in that direction, at that precise rhythm. "How long have you been seeing those headlights?" he asked. "Since the 2nd kilometer after the canal," she said. "I didn't want to speak before because I wasn't sure. Now I am." Renato did the math. The road to Anastasio was another 23 kilometers. The goal wasn't going to go over 120 on the downhill, and the vehicle behind seemed larger, heavier, but also faster. If they wanted to close in, they would close in before the city. "What do you know about this road?" he asked. Cida answered without taking her eyes off the front. She said there was an abandoned farm 8 kilometers away on the left, with a masonry shed that was about 500 meters from the road via a dirt trail. She said the trail didn't appear on Google Maps because it had been opened by the farm owners themselves to bypass a seasonal flooding area. She said she knew this because the son of the former owner had been a schoolmate of her daughter in Corumbá, and that she had visited that farm 3 or 4 times before the family sold the property. "How do you keep so much in your head?" he asked. She said, "When you spend your whole life being ignored, you learn to observe what others don't observe." Renato was quiet for a moment. There was something in her words that wasn't bitterness. It was closer to a fact stated with the same neutrality with which one would describe the weather. 8 kilometers, he said. "How long?" "About 6 minutes at this pace. We need to be inside the trail before they turn the curve." She stepped on the accelerator. The Gull's engine complained at the higher revs but responded, and the speedometer rose to the point where the bodywork began to vibrate like a thing that preferred to go slow, but was being convinced otherwise. The headlights behind accelerated too. The 6 minutes were 5. Cida entered the trail without reducing speed, which made the car jump in the first potholes and scratch the rear bumper on a rock sticking out of the ground. She turned off the headlights and continued in the dark for another 200 meters, using only memory and the faint clarity of the drizzle that had diminished to almost nothing. She stopped the car behind the shed and turned off the engine. They stayed in silence. 15 seconds later, the vehicle following them passed the entrance to the trail without slowing down, the headlights quickly sweeping the vegetation on both sides before moving on. They waited another 2 minutes. Nothing came back. Renato released the breath he had held without noticing. Sida opened the door and got out. He heard footsteps on the damp ground, and then her flashlight light reappeared outside. He got out too. She was examining the shed. The door lock was rusty but not stuck. It had fallen off long ago. She pushed the door and entered. The interior smelled of earth and damp wood, but there was a masonry bench at the back, solid, and some metal structures that looked like remains of irrigation equipment. "We are staying here until dawn," she said. Not as a question. Renato leaned against the shed wall and kept looking at her while she examined the space with the flashlight, methodical, checking every corner before sitting down. It was the same methodology with which he had seen her, now remembering, examining the rooms of the main house before cleaning, always a complete look before starting. He said, "Sida, I don't know your last name." She said, "Aparecida Moreno Camara, but everyone has always called me Sida, even those who should know my full name." Renato was silent for a moment. There was in that whole night a structure he was beginning to recognize, not as something that had happened to him, but as something that had been built over a long time by people who counted exactly on him, never paying attention to the right people. And the irony was that the only one who could undo it was exactly one of those he had never seen. Dawn in the Pantanal doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, first as a bluish clarity that the darkness hasn't yet decided to accept, then as an orange strip on the shallow horizon where the Cerrado meets the sky, and only then as full light, sudden almost, as if the sun had waited to be sure the world was ready before appearing. Renato had stayed awake all night, not out of an inability to sleep. He had slept in worse conditions, but because there were things that needed to be thought about in those hours before the movement restarted, and thinking worked better when no one else was awake to interfere. Sida had slept 3 hours leaning against the masonry bench with the beach towel from the car seat as an improvised pillow. She slept like someone who knows how to do it where and when the body asks, without ceremony and without drama. She woke up before the sun, went outside the shed, stayed a few minutes in the drizzle that had returned during the night, and came back with clear eyes and the posture of someone who was ready for whatever came. Renato had organized what he knew in order. First, Gustavo and Silvana were operating a management transfer that, if registered at the notary's office at 8 in the morning, would have immediate legal validity. He needed to arrive before that with documentation that would block or contest the process. Second, to do this he needed a lawyer he trusted, not from the Campo Grande firms associated with the farm, but someone from outside the system Gustavo had built over the years. Third, his brother had promised to send someone to the Anastasio station, and that someone was now the most reliable link he had. The cell phone had lost its charge during the night. No charger. Sida took a portable charger from her apron pocket, one of those rectangular and simple ones bought in a convenience store, and connected it to Renato's phone without saying anything. He looked at the object for a second before saying thank you. She said, "It's a habit. My daughter called me once in an emergency with her phone almost dead, and since then I always carry this." When the phone started working again, there were 3 messages from Dirceu. The last one said only, "Marley is at the station. She has what you need." Marley was Dirceu's eldest daughter, Renato's cousin, a lawyer graduated in Dorados with a specialization in agrarian law. A woman of 41 years who had never been part of the farm's business circle, exactly because Renato, in an excess of caution that now revealed itself as a providential precaution, had always kept the family separate from the corporate structure. They arrived at the Anastasio station at 6:40 in the morning. Marley was leaning against a silver Hilux with a folder of documents in her lap and a coffee in her hand, like someone who had woken up early and prepared with the same seriousness she applied to hearings. The meeting took place inside Marley's car, with the air conditioning on low and the map of the municipality of Corumba open on the tablet. Renato explained what he knew. Sida added what she had heard, with a precision of dates and terms that surprised Marley enough to make her raise her eyes from the notepad once. Marley said there were 2 fronts of immediate action. The first was an injunction to suspend any notarial act involving the Drummond Farms assets for a period of 48 hours. She had already drafted the request during the night based on what Dirceu had transmitted. She only needed Renato's signature and a statement from Cida as a witness. The second front was more delicate. There was a clause in the Articles of Incorporation of Fazenda Drummond Agropecuaria Ltda. that Renato had inserted years ago in one of the rare contract reviews he did without Gustavo's involvement, because it had been a period of temporary distrust that had later passed, or so he had thought. The clause established that any transfer of management exceeding 30% of the company's total assets required the consent of 2 secondary partners with more than 3 years of connection. The 2 secondary partners were Dirso and Marley. Renato looked at his cousin for a long moment. He said, "You knew about this clause." She said, "I drafted it. You didn't remember because it was 10 years ago and you signed 20 documents that day." Renato was silent. There was something slightly disconcerting about discovering that he had protected himself from a threat that didn't yet exist, and that the protection had come from people he had deliberately kept on the margins of the business. But there was something else Marley needed to say, and she said it with the care lawyers use when information is both good and complicated. The clause was valid, but it was only invocable if Renato appeared in person before the notary or a public official with full powers to prove identity. If the transfer process was initiated without him appearing to contest it, the clause expired in 48 hours by presumption of voluntary absence. It was 6:55 in the morning. The Corumba notary's office was 42 kilometers away via BR 262, with light traffic at that hour, 35 minutes by car. Renato looked at Marley. Then he looked at Cida, who was sitting in the back seat with Marley's notepad in her lap, where she had written her statement in small handwriting and much more organized than anyone could have expected from someone who had spent the night in an abandoned shed. Cida raised her eyes from the paper and said, "I'm done." Marley pulled the car out and put the fastest route to downtown Corumba into the GPS. The route along BR 262 at that hour was free of congestion, but not of tension. Renato kept an eye on the side mirror for the first 10 kilometers, checking if there was any vehicle coming from the same vicinity as the station. There wasn't, or not yet. The distance didn't mean they were free, it only meant they had time, and time was a variable he needed to manage with much more care than he had in the last few hours. Marley called her office in Dorados while driving, leaving a message for the secretary, with instructions to locate a contact in the Court of Justice of Mato Grosso do Sul as soon as business hours began. She didn't explain why. She only said it was urgent, and that the Drummond name was involved, which in the legal universe of that region was enough information to ensure the message would be treated with the necessary seriousness. Cida remained in silence in the back seat for much of the journey. Renato observed her in the rearview mirror a few times and noticed she wasn't resting. She was thinking. The type of thinking that doesn't produce facial expression, but manifests in a very slight contraction of the muscles around the eyes, like someone organizing a sequence of information in an order she hadn't yet revealed to anyone. And while the Hilux accelerated on BR 262, with the rising sun hitting through the side window, Renato realized there was something he needed to say. Not as a boss, not as the man who had arrived by jet the night before believing he controlled everything, but as someone who had spent an entire night being carried by the knowledge and courage of a person he had never seen before. "Cida," he said, "when this is all over, I want to talk about your contract." She didn't answer immediately. She kept looking out the window at the passing Cerrado, at the Seriema birds standing on the roadside, at the sky getting bluer with every minute the sun rose. Then she said, "We'll see about that later, Doctor. First, let's ensure you still have something to offer a contract for." And Marley, who was driving and hadn't smiled once since arriving at the station, let out a short and genuine laugh that echoed through the car for a second before she concentrated on the road again. The first notary office of Corumba was in an ochre-colored townhouse on Rua Frei Mariano, 2 blocks from the banks of the Paraguay River. It was one of those places the city had built before it knew it was going to grow, and which later became too small for the movement, but too big to be replaced without a fight. At 7:40 in the morning, the notary hadn't arrived yet, but the head clerk was already behind the counter with the key hanging around her neck and the metal-framed glasses she had worn since before the building had air conditioning. Marley entered first. Renato entered last, and there was a second in which the clerk recognized him and opened her mouth to say something before deciding it wasn't the time. There was another client in the waiting room, a man in a light suit with a folder of documents in his lap and a face of the type that says nothing but which Renato recognized immediately. It was the lawyer whose name was on the crest of the Campo Grande firm. The same name Tida had described the night before, the same man Gustavo had introduced as a logistics consultant 3 weeks ago. The man saw them enter. His composure lasted about 3 seconds before breaking in a very small way, a blink slightly longer than normal, a discreet swallow, but enough for someone who knew what they were looking for. Renato said nothing. He walked to the clerk and asked her to call the notary urgently, that there was a contestation of a notarial act to be filed before any other procedure of the day. The clerk went. The lawyer remained seated. Marley positioned herself so as to block access to the entrance door without making it seem intentional. The notary arrived at 8:02, slightly irritated by the early summons and carrying a coffee he hadn't finished. When he saw Renato Drummond in his waiting room, he stopped, looked at the lawyer in the light suit, looked back at Renato, and had the expression of a man who suddenly understands he is going to have a much more complicated day than he had planned. What followed lasted 40 minutes. Marley presented the injunction, which was drafted with the surgical precision of an agrarian law specialist who had spent the night over the text. Renato presented his identity documents and signed the presence protocol. Cida delivered her signed statement, handwritten, with full details, and her Kurumba ID number. The lawyer in the light suit tried to intervene once. Marley interrupted him with a reference to the Code of Civil Procedure that left him in silence long enough for the notary to accept the protocol. The notarial act of transfer that Gustavo had scheduled for 8 in the morning was suspended for 48 hours. When they left the notary's office, the sun was already high, and the heat of Corumbá was beginning to settle in with the seriousness the city reserved for October days. Renato stopped on the sidewalk and stood looking at the Paraguay River at the end of the street, wide and brown and indifferent to all the human history that had happened on its banks for centuries. Marley said the next step was to formally notify the board of directors of the farm, which included 2 external representatives whose contracts Gustavo didn't have the power to terminate unilaterally. She said this needed to happen in the next few hours before Gustavo knew what had occurred at the notary's office and took alternative measures. Renato was listening, but part of his attention was elsewhere. He was thinking about what Cida had said in the shed the night before, about the underground passage, about the lubricated hinges, about the cabinet that had been moved many times without leaving new marks on the concrete. There was something he hadn't asked yet, and now, with the immediate urgency resolved, he was ready to ask. "Cida," he said, "that passage behind the cedar cabinet. You said the hinges were lubricated, that someone maintained them, and that it wasn't you." She looked at him for a moment before answering. She said she had suspected some time ago, but that she had only confirmed it 6 weeks ago, that she had seen Gustavo leave through the back door of the basement one afternoon, at a time when he should have been in a meeting at the administrative headquarters, that she had waited, and that he had returned 40 minutes later by the same path, with his pants dirty with mud up to the knee. That she hadn't said anything because it wasn't her job to say anything. It wasn't her place to ask questions about what the farm administrator was doing in the underground corridors, but that she had kept the information. Renato was silent. The image formed with a logic that, once seen, couldn't be undone. Gustavo knew the tunnel. Gustavo had used the tunnel. And if Gustavo had used the tunnel to enter or leave the farm without being recorded by the headquarters cameras, there was a reason for that which went beyond simple adventure. There were meetings, there were people. There was another layer of what was happening that he hadn't reached yet. Marley noticed Renato's expression and asked what it was. He said they needed to go to the farm, not through the main entrance, but through the canal, that there was something in the basement he needed to check before Gustavo had a chance to reorganize whatever was stored there. Marley said that was imprudent, that legally the land was protected, but that physically it was still Gustavo's territory for another 48 hours. Renato said he knew. Cida said she also knew, and that she would go along. Marley looked at her for a moment with the expression of a lawyer evaluating an unexpected variable. Then she said, "Fine, but I'm driving," and the three returned to the Hilux with the Kurumba sun hitting their backs as if the entire Pantanal were waiting to see what happened next. On the way back to the farm, Renato stayed in the back seat beside Cedar, which was such a subtle inversion of hierarchy that no one commented, but everyone noticed. Marley drove with the same concentration with which she had presented the injunction, that technical attention that doesn't waste energy on details that don't affect the result. Renato said, looking out the window at the passing Curado, that he had spent 15 years trusting Gustavo to manage every aspect of the farm, that he had delegated because he had built systems and verified the systems and thought the systems were enough, that he had forgotten in that whole process that systems are made by people and that people change, and that change almost never appears in reports. Saida listened without interrupting. Then she said something that stayed in the car's air for several seconds after it was said, "The people we ignore always see more than the ones we pay attention to, because we never act differently in front of them." Marley, without taking her eyes off the road, said, "It should be taught in law schools." Renato was quiet with that for a good while. There was in that phrase something that wasn't just about that night. It was about a way of seeing the world that he had practiced for decades, and which now, in light of what had happened, seemed not only incomplete, but actively blind. The power he had been built on the ability to read people, or so he had believed. But reading people, he discovered now, depended on first seeing them. They entered through the side of the property at the same point of the canal where they had left in the early morning, with the Hilux hidden in the tall vegetation 200 meters from the canal. They descended through the iron grate to the tunnel, the three of them this time, with Marley's flashlight added to Saida's illuminating the path more generously than on the previous trip. The basement was different. Renato noticed this even before Saida pointed the flashlight to the back of the room. The smell had changed, no longer just earth and old copper, but paper. Lots of paper. The type of sweet and slightly rancid smell that accumulated documents exhale when they stay in a closed space for long enough. The cedar cabinet was in the same position they had left it, but there was something beside it that hadn't been there the night before. A file box, plastic, orange, of the industrial type that farms use to organize supplier contracts. It was closed with a simple seal that someone had opened and put back without pressing completely, which made the seal slightly wavy at the point of attachment. Marley was the first to approach. She opened the box with the precaution of someone who knows that what is inside can have legal value. What was inside was a layer of envelopes numbered in permanent pen from 1 to 19, each envelope with a date written in the upper right corner, covering a period of almost 8 months. Renato picked up envelope number 1. Inside was a copy of a contract, not of a transfer of management but of a land lease, a specific area of 3,200 hectares in the northeast sector of the farm, leased to a company based in Campo Grande, whose name was not familiar to him. The lessee was identified only by the tax ID, CNPJ, and the signature in the place of the legal representative of Fazenda Drummond was Gustavo's. Gustavo had signed lease contracts, in the farm's name, without Renato's consent, for 8 months. Marley picked up other envelopes. They opened them in silence, one by one, and the image that assembled was broader and older than anyone had expected. It wasn't just an attempt at management transfer activated on the eve. It was a carefully built process over almost a year, progressive leases of sectors of the farm, values deposited in a separate account, an account Gustavo had opened in the name of a holding company whose partners were he and Silvana. And there was more. In envelope 16 there was a copy of an income tax return presented to the Ministry of Agriculture with data that didn't correspond to the actual production of the farm, smaller, underestimated numbers, with Renato's electronic signature, forged in a way that would only be detectable by a specific document forensics expert. Silvana had signed as a witness to that declaration. Renato held that envelope for a moment longer than the others. There was something in the paper that was different from the betrayals he had been able to name up to that point. The illegal leases, the attempt to transfer management, Those were things he could classify within a logic of ambition and opportunity. But the forgery of his signature on a tax document was different. It was the type of thing that left a person exposed to consequences that went far beyond a corporate dispute. Cida was beside him. She said nothing but had placed the flashlight pointed upwards so as to illuminate the entire space without blinding anyone, a gesture of practicality that Renato was beginning to recognize as typical of her, always the right angle, always the exact measure of the necessary. He said, "You knew there was this here." She said, "I knew there was something. I didn't know what it was." Marley was already photographing the documents with her phone, systematic, each numbered envelope, each relevant page. She said those documents constituted sufficient proof for a contract termination process for cause, annulment of the leases, and opening of an administrative process with the Ministry of Agriculture. She said that with that in hand, Gustavo would have no way to sustain any legal position, neither the transfer of management, nor the leases, nor any agreement he had signed in the farm's name. She also said, with the clinical objectivity of someone giving news they already know will hurt, that Silvana had signed as a witness in at least 6 of the documents, that her participation was documented and dated, that the process that came next was inevitably a matter that went beyond the business. Renato remained in silence for a time that the other two respected without filling. Then he said, "Let's get out of here. There is one more thing that needs to be done before the end of the day." When they left through the tunnel and emerged at the canal, the Corumba sun was already at its highest point. The dry heat of the Pantanal in October didn't ask if anyone was prepared. It was simply there, present and non-negotiable like certain truths. Renato called Dirceu. He said he needed his brother to come to the farm through the main entrance, with a witness, in the early afternoon. He said the time had come for a conversation that had been postponed for too long. Dirceu asked if he was okay. Renato said he was, and then he said something he hadn't said to his brother in 20 years, that he missed him, that he wanted him to come not just as a partner, but as family. On the other end of the line, Dirceu was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I was already on the road when you called." Renato put the phone away and stood looking at the farm in the distance, at the sheds and the pastures and the white main house with the closed windows that hid what had happened that night. There were 46,000 hectares of that soil, and every meter had been built on an idea of power he had confused with security. Cida was by his side, the orange file box in her hand, the navy blue uniform still with the mud from the canal on the hems. He said, "You saved all of this." She looked at the farm. Then she looked at him, and she said with the same direct voice and without embellishment she had used from the beginning, "I only did what any person would do if someone finally looked at them at the right moment." Renato stayed with that phrase for a long time, and he realized that the question of who had saved what was more complicated than it seemed, because what was standing that afternoon was not just a farm. It was also a version of himself that had begun to be rebuilt the moment a man who controlled 46,000 hectares had decided, in a dark hallway, to trust the only person in the world who didn't need to trust anything else to survive. Marley arrived beside them with the phone still in her hands, the camera full of records of the documents. She said she was going to need at least 2 hours to organize the material and draft the necessary protocols. She said the best place to do that was far from the farm in neutral territory, where Gustavo couldn't appear with face-to-face arguments before the legal processes were formalized. Renato agreed, but he said that before that, there was one thing he wanted to do. He called the number of the farm's administration office, Gustavo's direct extension, which he knew by heart but had called fewer than 10 times in the last 2 years because there was always someone to intermediate communications. The phone rang 3 times. Gustavo answered on the 5th ring with a voice slightly hoarse from someone under pressure, the type of voice that tries to sound normal and doesn't completely succeed. Renato said only, "I am at the farm, and the documents from the basement are with me." There was a silence of 8 seconds on the other end of the line. Renato counted mentally. Then he said, "My lawyer will contact you later today. I suggest yours be available." And he hung up. Cida observed him during the entire call without changing her expression. When he put the phone away, she said, "Was it necessary to do that now?" He said, "Yes, because Gustavo is going to spend the next few hours trying to understand the size of what happened, and while he is doing that math, he won't make any impetuous decisions." She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "It makes sense." And the three walked back to the Hilux on the bank of the canal, with the orange file box between them and the pantanal around exuding that thick heat that asks no one for apologies. The meeting of the Board of Directors of Fazenda Drummond Agropecuaria Ltda was called for 4 in the afternoon of the same day, which in the company's bylaws corresponded to the minimum period of 6 hours from the urgent protocol, a period Marley had fulfilled with clockmaker precision while organizing the documents on a table in a hotel in Corumbá where no one knew them. The space chosen for the meeting was not the farm's headquarters. It was the hall of a rural association in Corumbá, a neutral location with a long table, wooden chairs and a window air conditioner that made more noise than cold. Marley had reserved the space by phone at 10 in the morning without explaining why. At 4 o'clock sharp, those present were Renato, Dirceu, Marley as legal representative, 2 external board members who had arrived from Campo Grande on a commercial flight summoned by Marley with the indication that the meeting was classified as urgent and confidential, and a representative from Gustavo's law firm, who was there only to register presence and whose expression revealed he had been informed of the situation on the way. Gustavo did not attend, nor did Silvana. The absence of both was in itself an answer. Marley presented the documents from the basement with the methodical organization of someone who had spent 5 hours transforming physical evidence into solid legal argumentation. The board members read in silence. One of them asked to reread envelope 16. Then he closed it and sat looking at the table for a moment. The process for Gustavo's removal as administrator of the farm was approved unanimously at 5:40 in the afternoon, with immediate effect. The irregular leases were declared null for lack of corporate authorization. The formal notification to the Federal Revenue Service about the irregularity in the income tax return would be filed by Marley the following morning. Renato signed each document with the same pen he had used for years, a black Mont Blanc he had received from his father on the day he signed the farm's deed for the first time, at 24. There was something circular about it that he noticed but didn't verbalize. When the meeting ended and the board members left, only Renato, Dirceu and Marley remained in the room. And Cida, who had sat in the corner during the entire meeting with a glass of water in her hand, invisible to everyone there except for Renato, who had looked at her 3 times during the votes, not asking for confirmation, but checking if she was okay. Dirceu looked at his brother for a long moment after the others left. There were 10 years of difference and 20 years of distance, and between them was the type of silent accumulation that families produce when they go too long without speaking. But there was also, underneath all that, the recognition of blood that doesn't disappear even in the longest estrangements. Dirceu said, "You never called me at 2 in the morning before." Renato said, "I know." Dirceu said, "It was time." Renato said, "It was." There was nothing more to add to that, and both knew it, so they didn't add anything. Marley had discreetly left to make calls. Renato and Cida remained in the long room with the table full of signed documents and the noisy air conditioner and the Corumbá sun that entered obliquely through the louvered window and made stripes on the wooden floor. He said, "I want you to know what this meant." She said, "I already know." He said, "It's not enough for me to know. I need you to know that I know." Cida stood looking at him for a moment. There was in her expression something that wasn't exactly emotion. It was more like the recognition of someone who has spent a long time waiting for an obvious thing to finally be said out loud. She said, "You are the first boss in 22 years who looked me in the eyes to thank me for something. The others thanked the heir or the next person in line. Never me." Renato stayed with that. Then he said, "I want to make a formal proposal. Not as a cleaning lady. I want you to take care of the internal communication of the farm with the employees, supervision of the service teams, monitoring of working conditions, direct report to me, with a contract, health insurance, and a salary appropriate for the position." Cida listened until the end without interrupting. Then she was silent for a few seconds, which Renato had already learned to recognize as the time she needed to verify if what she was hearing was real before responding. She said, "I accept, on one condition." He said, "What?" She said, "That you learn the names of all the farm employees, not out of obligation, because it's the right thing." Renato stood looking at her. And then he did something he hadn't done as long as he could remember in any business situation or public life. He smiled for real, not the calculated smile of photographs with governors, not the controlled expression of board meetings. A simple, slightly awkward smile, the kind that appears when someone is surprised by a demand that is both reasonable and completely unexpected. He said, "We have a deal, Aparecida Moreno Camara." She said, "You can call me Cida." And in that rural association hall in Corumbá, with the table full of documents that ended one chapter and opened another, with the Pantanal outside exuding the end of the day, with that orange light that Mato Grosso do Sul reserves for October afternoons, Renato Drummond realized that the hardest day of his life had been guided, from beginning to end, by the woman he had hired 2 years ago without even asking her name, and that the farm that was still his was standing not because he had been the most powerful the night before, but because someone who owed absolutely nothing to him had decided, for reasons that were entirely hers, that the right thing was to do the right thing. Marley entered with her phone in hand and said there was one last issue to address. Gustavo's lawyer had sent a settlement proposal, departure without public scandal, return of the lease amounts in installments, termination of any additional processes, all conditioned on the silence of all parties. Renato read the proposal. Then he passed it to Cida, who read it slowly, line by line, with the attention of someone checking if they understood everything before giving an opinion. She handed the phone back without saying anything. Renato asked, "What do you think?" She said, "I'm not a lawyer, doctor, but I think the question you should ask is not whether you're going to accept it or not. It's what you want this episode to mean from now on." Marley, from the back of the room, said, "She's right." Renato stayed with that for a moment. There were 52 years of life built on the premise that power defended itself with hardness. But there was also, on that afternoon, the awareness that what a man does when he wins says more about him than what he did to win. He said, "Accept the deal. With one addition, Gustavo and Silvana's holding company will be independently audited in the next 90 days. If the values match, the matter is closed." Marley said she could include that, and she did. The sun had set completely when they left the hall. Corumbá at night had a temperature that wasn't cool yet, but had already stopped being unbearable. Renato and Cida stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the empty street. He said, "Give me your daughter's number." Cida looked at him with an expression that wasn't distrust but was caution. He said, "For the case of an emergency. The next time I need someone trustworthy 250 kilometers away in the middle of the night, I want to have the right contact." She stood looking at him for a second, then she said the number out loud, slowly so he could save it. He saved it with her full name, Aparecida Moreno Camara. And for the first time in 2 years of work at Fazenda Drummond, Cida's name was registered on the boss's phone not as administrative data, but as what it was, the contact of a person he knew. 3 months later, Fazenda Drummond had a new staff board at the entrance of the main house. Not a board of rules or warnings, a simple board of lightwood with the names of all 47 workers of the property, permanent and day laborers, in alphabetical order, with their role beside each name. It had been Cida's idea, and it had been installed in the first week after her hiring as internal communication coordinator, a position she now held with a signed contract, health insurance, and a small but private office at the back of the administrative headquarters. Renato had fulfilled the condition. He had learned the names. It had taken him 3 weeks, with a printed list in his pocket that he discreetly consulted during the first rounds through the property, until the names fixed themselves where they needed to fix. Not in the short-term memory of business, but in the memory that recognizes people. The audit process of Gustavo's holding had confirmed the values of the irregular leases, and the return was being made within the agreed time frame. Silvana had moved away from the region. The deal had been fulfilled without public scandal, not out of generosity, but out of a calculated decision by Renato that silence in that specific case was more useful than the noise. Dirchu had visited the farm twice in the following 3 months. On the second visit, he stayed a week and walked through the entire property with Renato, which hadn't happened since they were young and their father was still alive. They talked about things that weren't business. They talked about their grandfather and about the tunnels their grandfather had built, and about the kind of precaution the older generations had with the idea of always having an exit available. And they talked more than once about cider. Dircho had said on a porch afternoon that there was a beautiful irony in the fact that the only tunnel Renato had needed that night was one he didn't know, in his own house, discovered by a woman who cleaned the corners he didn't see. Renato had said yes, that he had thought about that many times. Dircho had said, "And what did you conclude?" Renato had been silent for a moment. Then he said, "That power without attention is a house without a foundation. It looks solid from the outside, but the first heavy rain shows what's missing underneath." Dirchu had stood looking at the Pantanal horizon, where the sun set in that specific orange that happened only in October. Then he said, "Father would say you took a long time to understand that." Renato said, "Father would be right." And the two remained in silence for a time that was the type of silence that only exists between people who no longer need to fill the space to prove they are together. Cida had called her daughter that night in Corumba, right after leaving the Rural Association Hall. The conversation had lasted 40 minutes, which was long for a call between the two, who normally communicated in short and objective messages because of different work and study shifts. The daughter had asked what had happened. Cida had told her. Not everything. There were parts that still needed more distance to be told, but enough for the daughter to understand that her mother had spent the longest night of her life doing the simplest thing, telling the truth at the right time to the right person, and trusting that it was enough. The daughter had said, "You never told me about the tunnel." Cida had said, "Because you never asked where the exits were." The daughter had been silent for a second. Then she had said, "Now I'm asking." And Cida had said, "Then I'll tell you everything." There was one last thing no one knew, except Cida, that on the morning of the day she had discovered the tunnel, 3 months before the night Renato returned from Campo Grande, she had entered the basement out of curiosity, moved the cabinet, opened the door, and walked through the corridor to the end. She had climbed through the iron grate, had come out on the bank of the canal, and had stood still looking at the farm from the outside, the entire structure of Fazenda Drummond seen from an angle that none of those who lived inside it knew. She had stood looking for about 10 minutes, and she had thought a simple thing, that from the outside, every construction of power looks like the same thing, a series of walls that protect those inside and exclude those outside, but that the walls always have somewhere a passage that someone forgot to close, and that the people who clean the corners are almost always the first to find it. She had closed the grate, had gone back through the tunnel, had replaced the cabinet, and had gone up to continue cleaning the second floor, and she had kept what she knew, as she always did, waiting for the moment when knowing that mattered to someone besides her. That moment had arrived, and she had been ready. There was still one thing Cida's daughter said in that 40-minute call, something Cida kept the same way she kept everything that mattered, without announcing it, without turning it into a speech, just letting it rest in an internal place where things settle and become part of who one is. The daughter had said, "Mom, you spent your whole life teaching me to be invisible, not to make noise, not to call attention, to do the job well without expecting someone to notice. I always thought it was out of fear. Now I think it was something else." Cida had asked, "What do you think it was?" And the daughter had said, "It was because you knew that the people who really see are rare, and that when they appear, you need to already be ready, because the window is small and the moment passes." Cida had stayed in silence for a few moments with the phone to her ear and the empty Corumba street in front of her. Then she had said, "It's exactly that." The daughter had said, "Then you were waiting for him." And Cida had responded, with the voice of someone confirming a truth that needs no elaboration, "I was waiting for the moment. He just happened to be the first one who was there. Dear person who made it this far, thank you for walking along through every dark hallway, every stone tunnel, every decision made in the hardest hour of the night. Renato and Sida's story is a reminder that the most important people are sometimes those who pass through our lives in silence, doing what needs to be done, even when no one is looking. If this story touched you, if you stayed until the end without being able to stop, then you already know what this channel does. It brings stories that grip, that move, that stay. Subscribe now so you don't miss any of them. Leave your like. It tells us you want more. And in the comments tell us, have you ever had a person like that in your life? Someone who was there, invisible, and who made all the difference when it mattered most. We want to read it. See you in the next story. End of the story.